Hello and welcome everyone to this week's episode of DoubleDM Podcast, where we are talking about a topic I entirely forgot because that episode has been edited weeks ago and I didn't bother to check what topic we're recording because it's been 2 weeks since we recorded last on DoubleDM Podcast. So, Niels, after 2 weeks, how are you doing?
I'm doing more or less fine currently.
More or less fine.
More or less fine, yeah. Teeny bit ill. I got a bit of a cold, but nothing too bad. The last 2 weeks were a bit weird, you could say. Not the best weeks, but I managed, so here I am, fucking glad to record with you again. It's been too long. Couldn't wait, and glad to do this again. How about you?
Yeah, I feel the exact same way. 1 week we've canceled recording because of you. 1 week we canceled because of me. So it all balances out. We've both taken breaks from this. And now we're finally back, ready to record and do the shit. At least I hope so.
Hell yeah. So as per usual, did you have any TTRPG related stuff in the last 2 weeks that's worth talking about?
In the last 2 weeks, no, I think I did not have that much TTRPGs happening. It was Halloween, which is like, some people love playing Halloween-themed TTRPG sessions.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't. About the liking part is up for debate. I've never played a Halloween-themed session because every time I do plan one, people cancel on me.
Oh, boy. Yeah, something similar happened to me with the Halloween-themed one-shot. We planned on doing one, but then everyone except one person canceled. So actually, I talked to that one person and we found another person to play with us and just improvised, or I just improvised one myself rather quickly. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. If you're all on the same page and all the safety tools in place, it is going to be amazing if you're all up for it. We all were, so perfect. Was a really spooky kind of eldritch cosmic horror thingamajig with a cursed moon that set the whole city ablaze. At least it seemed like it. My players told me it felt really like something along the lines of Bloodborne things. So since that was what I was going for anyway, I think I did a great job. So
yeah. Nice. I had a session on Halloween, however, it wasn't really Halloween themed. It was more of a one shot because one of my friends also has a birthday on Halloween. So, right, I get why, for example, he isn't able to show up to TTRPG sessions at that time. Still, he ran a one-shot for himself or for his group of our friends. And yeah, we played a level 19 one-shot.
Oh boy.
Where we had to enter a dungeon and then follow the tracks of a group of lost explorers. We haven't found them, but basically every room of this dungeon was different. There was a room where we had to input 5 different damage types to open a door that were only visible to us when we put in a wrong order of damage types. Then had a golem attack us and had to survive 5 rounds against it to see in which round he used which damage type.
Okay.
Then we had another room where we had spiders. A lot of spiders, a spider jungle that every 5 minutes or so, the room basically turned upside down.
Oh boy.
And we had to get to a door that was at first at the top, then at the bottom, then at the top, then at the bottom again, right? The good thing was that I played a monk, so I just did not care about the fall damage when I fell from the ceiling and just fell to the door, opened the door and went through.
And even if it would have been on the top, you could have just ran up the freaking wall, right?
Yeah, but I didn't want to get into the spider webs, which basically covered the entire wall.
Okay, yeah, fair.
So I just stood there, looked at the door, thought about myself, well, I can also fly, by the way, because I'm a ascended dragon monk. But then the room turned, I was like, okay, I just fall to the door. It's not hard. Went through the door with one of the other people who was also playing a monk. Then we disappeared through the door and had another room with 5 altars, each having 2 orbs orbs on them and a chain and an iron chain. The 2 orbs, and you were destroying them, you had to roll a d4, a d6, and a d8. The d4 determined if you would increase or decrease. The d6 would determine which stat of the 6 ability scores, and the d8 would be indicating of how much you decrease or increase.
Okay.
So for a short time, my monk had a wisdom of 23, but also a charisma of -5.
Oh boy. Okay.
So that was fun. So I was at a 1 of charisma already. My character became more abrasive, more insulting, and whatever. Right? He became much more like a douche. And the other monk was like, no, I want my friend back. Threw another one of these orbs at me. Deflect missile, throw it back. Deflect missile, throw it back. It shattered on me. And basically it became a snowball fight with glass orbs.
Okay.
Until we didn't have no more. And yeah, basically
perfect.
All of the orbs cumulated to me getting a +1 increase to my wisdom.
Okay.
That's all the orbs did for me, I think. Right? When you rolled an 8 on the d8, you could have increased one of your stats by 8. Now imagine, my monk already has a dexterity of 22 thanks to the magic item, the manual of learning or whatever that it's called. That gets you a +2 to your dexterity, even across 20, so to 22. If I get a +8 to my dex, I had a 30 dex.
Yeah.
That would have been disgusting. Sadly, I didn't. I only really got my charisma up, down, up, down, up, down. Sad, but happens. And then we ended the session there. And yeah, that was basically all the TTRPGs I've had through the last 2 weeks. Very, very sadly, our recording sessions have all been canceled in those last 2 weeks. And I'm talking about all. That includes actual plays, right? The reasons were good. Stuff happens. People get sick, especially at this time of the year.
Yep.
Is it still sad? Yes, it's
understandable,
very sad.
but sad anyways.
So that's TTRPG things. Is there anything life-wise you want to talk about?
Nothing really. But I have one thing to add to TTRPGs.
Oh, you have one more thing.
Yeah, I have one more thing. This Tuesday, I had my usual Tuesday group again. We are currently trying to find a golden statue that was stolen and blah, 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 all of that. It doesn't really matter that much, but we only have one session left to finish the arc. That's going to be the last Tuesday in November, I think. And then what we are planning to do is during the Christmas time or during December, trying out all kinds of different systems or different styles of play and all of that. And then, since we're currently running 3 campaigns in the same group, one arc is going to be finished. We are starting the new year with a new arc in my campaign because in my campaign, one of my arcs just finished the last session they had. So we are going to have this hopefully interesting and funny transition phase of just trying out different shit and having fun at the same time while completing one arc and then transitioning into the start of a new one, but in a new campaign or a different campaign. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this. That's
any
just something
systems already pinned down?
We wanted to run Aegon because one of our members of this group is really interested in or really hyped about ancient history and myths and legends and stuff. So that system just fits perfectly. And then something more science fiction-y. We are currently deciding if it's Starfinder or Cyberpunk or something along those lines. So something more modern or futuristic. Yeah. And then let's just see what comes up. Let's see what we want to do.
Horror in space, I can only recommend Mothership.
Yeah, true. Mothership, that was completely off my radar. Good stuff, yeah. All right.
Just putting it out there because I think Mothership is my favorite, let's say, real sci-fi TTRPG.
Yeah, that was the kind of like Alien.
Exactly that. But for that, Mothership is still my favorite because it is horror. It is survival horror in basically desolate wastelands of asteroid belts and on a moon that is hunted by invisible monsters and shit.
Or on a ship that if the hull just nicks a bit, you're all gone. Yeah.
One other thing, TTRPG or game related, is the fact, right, that Alice's Missing's expansion is out.
Cool. Okay. Did not know about that.
Yeah, it had a very successful Kickstarter run like 3 to 4 months ago. And they've released all the stuff a while back already. And I'm hoping for Roll20 to get it done by the Christmassy time. So maybe I can get a group together to play that new expansion.
If you would like to have me.
That's why I'm bringing it up right now.
I'd be glad to play.
I'm bringing it up right now just because of that, because I've been looking forward to actually playing that, and I know someone that I would love to play with who is sitting across from me on the other side of this recording device. Yeah, and basically, that's kind of it, TTRPG-wise at least. Once again, life-wise, I have one thing.
Okay.
Because tomorrow, on Saturday, the 11th of November, 2023, is the Berlin Team Championship in Kendo.
Okay.
And I am competing with my team of very, very, very experienced and good people. And I'm very happy to be part of that team because they're all very great people also outside of Kendo. And I think we have no chances of winning the entire thing. I'm gonna be very honest. We have at least one team from our own Kendo club that is better than us because, right, we are putting 3 teams forward. Basically, one team that is supposed to win the thing or that we are putting into the race to compete for the thing, like to get top 3 or top 2. We have the team that I am part of, which is more or less the experienced ones, maybe make it out of the group stage. And then we have a team of beginners that is supposed to just get experience of fighting. It's also my first tournament, but because I've been doing Kendo for so long, I am actually moving up to the experienced fighter bracket for our organization. Yeah, right. It's a pool system. There are 4 groups basically. Everyone in that group fights everyone once, and then the 2 teams that are on top get out. Then into typical knockout stages, everyone fights. The tournament begins at 10 or something, but you have to be there very early because they have to check your materials, if you have everything up to code, if you're eligible for fighting, and then it goes. And then, I'm gonna spend the entire day there, probably eat, drink, and have fun at Kendo, and hopefully at least make a point or 2 in my fights.
Perfect.
Because I have at least 2 fights. Those are guaranteed because I have a pool of 3 teams and I am in one team. So, right, I get to fight at least 2 times. We just have to hope that we win.
That's the way. Alrighty. So if you don't have anything else?
I have nothing else.
Me neither. So I think we're ready to go, right?
Yeah, I think we are ready to dive into our episode. Whatever episode topic it is, have fun with it. Hey listener, how are you enjoying the show so far? Tell us about it in whatever way you see fit. Go to our social media pages and add us or DM us about your favorite episode of the show. We would love to hear from you on what impact our show might have had on your home games. Or you could review us on your podcast app of choice and leave us a nice message with a 5-star review. And if you want to go above and beyond, bring a friend into the fold. Tell them about our show and refer us to them so they can get a piece of the pie as well. Thank you for listening to DoubleDM and joining us on this incredible journey. So, Niels, as always, right? DoubleDM is a podcast in the TTRPG space, taking part in conversations, discourse, basically, right? We're a talk show. We talk about stuff that is currently going on and things that have plaguing us specifically.
That's correct. I hope so, at least.
It's just how the show works, right? We have to talk about everything. And there's a few topics that we've basically said that we are putting off as long as we can because we just do not like talking about them. I mean, from all the clips that we've had talking about fudging dice, right? You could make an entire episode just of that and call it the fudging episode. And maybe I will do that so we never have to do an actual fudging episode, right? And there's a few other points of contention in the space, and some of them are needed. Sometimes you have to talk about stuff as a space and have discourse, and some other things are just absurd and dumb and do not need to be discussed or should not be discussed, or even if they are discussed, stay away from me with that, because I do not fucking need your discussion about, I don't know, for example, the combat wheelchair, which is something that has been happening a few weeks ago when this episode comes out. And in that discussion, there's always this talk about realism and historical accuracy and blah, 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 blah. So let me put it down plainly. The combat wheelchair is not about historical accuracy or realism. It is about enabling folks that want to play this game and want themselves to feel represented, be represented with that in the characters created. And if that tool, the combat wheelchair, does that, which it does, we don't need to discuss if it's a good or bad thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't care. It is a good thing because people are feeling included and represented that way. They feel like they are able to play out something that they've desperately wanted to play out. For example, when this person that is playing is physically disabled and wants to play a character that is overcoming that physical disabilities just like they are in real life, the combat wheelchair is a tool to do so.
Yeah.
We don't need to talk about the mechanics of it. We don't need to talk about anything about it. It is just the generalized tool that is being used. And it's also the generalized tool that the Discord and vitriol around this discourse is around. One thing, the creator, Mustang Art, as their handle, has done a phenomenal job of making sure that this wheelchair is great. And so, Mustang Art, the creator, did a great job of creating that. And they did great strides to include wheelchairs in all different kinds of systems so people can be represented across all different kinds of systems. That's a good thing. Baseline, pure. I don't need anything else to discuss on that. I want to talk about that realism thing, to remove it from the combat wheelchair talk.
Yeah.
Because, the argument against the combat wheelchair oftentimes becomes, it's not realistic, it's not historically accurate, my dungeons do not have ramps because why would they? So we can debunk that through historical accuracy alone. Anyway, those dungeons did have ramps. There were not necessarily like fantasy wheelchairs, obviously, in ancient
fucking carts and wheelbarrows.
There were enough possibilities for people with physical disabilities to get around and also still do stuff. There were people that have still fought wars with just one hand. They've won several combats with just one hand. That's also a physical disability. But regardless, I want to talk about this realism because a lot of people base their bigotry, in that realism, saying, this is not realistic and I want realism from my games. And I say, I also want realism from my games, but I don't want it to be offensive to anyone, right? Yeah. But that's what I want to talk about. Realism in TTRPGs. How much do you need it? Is it even worth pursuing to have a game that is realistic or accurate to historical events or something? Or is that just a hoax to even think about realism?
Well, I think this is a loaded question because, first of all, I think realism and historical accuracy are two completely different things. Because it's in the nature of the game that you are playing, whether it can be historically accurate or not. Because if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or The Dark Eye, or basically any type of setting with magic in it and weird shit cannot be historically accurate to a certain degree, because magic and shit, and that's not a problem at all. It's just a thing. It can be realistic though. There's a difference between those two terms, I think, that should be made. But in general, it's regarding what type of game you're playing and what type of vibe you're playing within that game. What you've discussed as a table beforehand, how much realism or how realistic something should be, or how grounded in historical accuracies it should be.
It's a session 0 discussion about realism and how much you want things to be explainable, right? We've talked about magic and how any attempt at explaining magic away is kind of null and void, because it is magic. It's just supposed to work. If you think about it too much, it breaks apart. But at the same time, you should still find a way to base it in realism, just a little bit. Yeah. Right? One thing that I, for example, love about one of my Dark Eye games is our GM. We have an illusionist at our table, right? And he's a master at this. He is able to create any illusion of any kind of scale, of any kind of way, and it's just perfect, basically, right?
Yeah.
And our GM said, well, illusions in this game, in my iteration of the game, work basically just like light manipulation.
Okay.
You manipulate the light so that what people see and for example also feel, because at some point the illusions can also make people feel stuff, is basically just in their heads. But basically all illusions that are based on vision are based on light, giving the illusions both an advantage if you play that outright and also a disadvantage if it just doesn't work for you, right? But that's basically how it works. And I think it's great because that means only people that can see your illusions would also be tricked by it. If enemies close their eyes, they do not see your illusions anymore.
Basically out of sight, out of mind, and something along those lines, yeah.
It makes total sense, right? If you create a sound illusion, right, you then again trick the people in different ways. And it makes so much sense. And it's so great. At the same time, it can often lead to frustration. I will admit that sometimes when a cool idea just doesn't work because it just would not work in any way physically possible, with the argument being from one side, well, it is magic, it's supposed to work. Then again, right, go to the rule book, see what the rule book says. And if the rule book says this spell is basically supposed to do exactly that, then the argument of this is not realistic obviously falls apart. Because I think one thing about realism that should be established first is the rule book has more say than what really works, what realistically works. Because the rule book is the basis of your realism.
Exactly.
You need to base your realism and your understanding of how the world in your game works on the rules.
And I think there you can see that no matter what type of setting you are discussing, realism can always be there, but still be historically inaccurate. That's just the difference between those now with an example. And yeah, I think like you just mentioned with the magic, as long as there is something that can explain it to a certain degree, it doesn't have to be over-explained and therefore fall apart. Especially with magic, that's a thing. But like you said, for example, illusion magic is being either light, sound, or mind manipulation to some degree. That's I could imagine that being in a fantasy setting, that being just a realistic approach to how magic works for those certain instances. And then the deeper you go into that, the more weird and broken it gets. But it's still it has an in-world explanation. And I think this is the thing that makes something realistic. As long as there is an in-world explanation for why this works or how this works.
Yeah, right. It's also just the most fair, because I think a lot of people think when they talk about their realism, right, it is the fairness that they want to evoke at their tables. At least that's how they base it, right? This is realistic and therefore it is fair because it applies to everyone. But I think that is a call you as the GM make. Obviously, you could have talked about that in session 0, but even then I still think that that's just wrong. Your fairness should not be based on something you make up by your experiences, but by the hard facts that the game tells you, right? That's where your fairness should lie. Everything the game book says goes, except if you obviously say, okay, let's change something up about the game book.
Yeah.
But that is a session 0 talk as well. But the game book, if it is not explicitly stated, for me, counts as the basis of fair play. If I read the book, find what I want to do, say I'm going to do that, and my GM says that won't work, right? At the same time, I think, okay, the book says, though, it will work. So I should say the book says otherwise. But at the same time, right, this is a table thing. And I think one important thing to always state for tables, and this goes above realism as well, you as the table are allowed to override anything. But it is a table thing, right? If your GM then explains to you, okay, yeah, I get what the book is saying, but there is this obstacle in your way, and that makes that just, in my mind, impossible because of how this will realistically work. You still have to abide by the gravity of my world. And I go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Then it doesn't work. Okay, what else can I do, right? And I think at the end, your realism isn't something that is defined at all by just what you think works in the real world, in our world, but what you as a table define works in this world.
Exactly.
The book sets you the foundation. These are the rules. This is how the game is supposed to be played. You can make your changes if you want, but when you make your changes, it might also break the realism of that book. So just be aware of that, I think. But I think it's very important in a session 0 to talk about that realism, right? Because you don't want to blindside your players with something that you thought would be assumed while they were thinking of something entirely different, especially with things that do not exist in our real world. Trying to explain them away with real world physics or something can work, yes, but it can also not work. And it can it's basically a coin flip if it works or not.
Yeah.
And is that a good thing? I don't know. Maybe, yes, no. I don't know. It's 50-50.
Exactly. But that's definitely a talk that you have to have in session 0 and make the distinction between real world realism and in-world realism. Especially there was one thing that I read. I don't know exactly the numbers anymore, but the spell prestidigitation in D&D says somewhere instantly warm a surface to being felt warm in the hand. And if you think about it too hard using real-life physics, this spell would be the most broken of them all. Just take a piece of frozen nitrogen and instantly warm it so it feels warm in the hand. Within the split of a second.
Yeah.
Boom. The amount of energy that is would be needed to do that in that short amount would just instantly explode the fucking world. If you think about that too hard. That's the problem. But in-world, it obviously works because of the things that you've discussed as a table. And let's be real, we don't want to think about blowing the world up by just making a piece of ice warm and therefore not still being a piece of ice but warm. But if you use that on a piece of ice, it melts. Something along those lines. And it's not instant, but over the, blah, 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 blah. All of that completely debunking a quote unquote level 0 spell to being it the most broken thing ever. Basically, I cast nuke. So,
But I also, I get why people want to base a lot of stuff in realism. Because, for example, that is a genuinely great plan. Like building a bomb out of basic necessities in these worlds because you have the knowledge of that and how it realistically would work. And now comes a pitfall. That is the first pitfall of realism, I think, and why everyone that says, I don't want realism in my games, might be at the same time correct, but also, I don't want to say hypocritical, but you need realism in your games. You can try to remove it as much as possible, but at the end of the day, you're a person living on this earth in this day and age. Your storytelling is based on the experiences you've made in this world, meaning that you will tell a story that somehow, some way abides by basic physical laws, that abides by the table of elements, by the periodic table, because that is all you know. And you are not able to really conceive a reality without. You can try your best to add to it, Adding magic, adding more periodic elements, adding whatever the fuck else for science and technologies, time travel.
Adding periodic elements would be a bad idea if you think about it too hard.
Yeah, but again, you can do that if you want. You can. And let's be real. When you're playing a game, go for it. Do it. At the same time, you are still basing everything you are telling in your story in some way on that experiences of the, for example, periodic table and the physical laws and the laws of nature and whatever else. Because it is just because you've experienced it for your whole life.
Exactly. You can't imagine anything without.
And even if you try your best to detach from it, you might get detached from it, but that detachment then is only informed by your experiences still. So you need your realism anyway. It is impossible to play a game without realism.
Exactly.
However, you don't have to explain stuff away with realistic physics, with realistic chemistry, but you will still need physics and chemistry to work.
Exactly. If you completely remove these things, you don't know how the world should work. And therefore, it just feels like something and nothing really matters, at least for me. When there are some basic things that I can imagine and have experienced myself, like, for example, gravity is a big thing. I can't really imagine a whole world without gravity. It's hard for me to imagine that and how that would play. All the things that this entails, basically. Because, I can imagine our group doesn't or isn't affected by a gravity. But what about the fucking plants and anything in it? Everything that we know and describe is kind of just the way that it is because of gravity in a way. Because it grows just like that because of gravity and blah, 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 all of that, right? And just completely striking that from existence is hard to think about. And I think most people, it's the same for most people, at least most of them that I play with, that every fantasy world that I've been in, read about, visited, played in, whatever the fuck, had some sort of gravity, but without needing the need or having the need to state, yeah, by the way, this world has gravity in it, like it's some sort of special thing. Because I think the most basic form of realism, like taking the basic rules, quote unquote rules of our world and porting that into a fantasy setting and just adding stuff, is the most normal and basic thing for realism to be. And I think everyone does that.
I just feel like everyone has to.
Yeah.
Right? You can make a story obviously without gravity. Just set it in space.
Exactly.
But that is then still based on the fact that there are planets that have gravity.
Exactly this.
You will always base your stuff in realism. However, I still think that, at least personally for me, I want something that shakes that realism up in my games. Be that fantasy magic, or be that sci-fi tech, or be that, I don't know, something, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, both still have gravity, both still have periodic elements.
Yeah, even though you don't necessarily explore every bit of or every single element of that periodic table or every law of physics down to the last digit or last formula. It doesn't fucking matter. It's just, yeah, it's there. Period. Done. So your world kind of works in a way. But then you add magic or tech beyond our comprehension. That is basically the cyberpunk thing. Because to be honest, just through cyberpunk things, I can imagine now that you just switch out an arm or your lungs or whatever. But without that, it's something that I wouldn't be able to grasp, basically. Just making yourself into a cyborg completely without you changing at all. But that's a different thing. But that's something that shakes up our understanding of the world a bit. Fun stuff. It can be fun stuff if you don't over-explain it. But coming back to more focused realism, because I think what we just talked about was the baseline of every world that you create or created or play in, with the bigger things like laws of physics, periodic tables, and then adding third elements to that, magic, tech, whatever. But if you go down to a more or a smaller scale, like how do weapons work or something along those lines that are reflected by the rules. There's sometimes, especially in fantasy settings, I like a bit more quote unquote realism or historical accuracy in that regard. So that one weapon isn't just the same as another, but looks different and costs more. Looking at short sword versus scimitar in D&D, for example. Same fucking weapon.
Yeah.
Different cost. Spear and trident. One is a simple weapon. The other one is a martial weapon. One costs 1 silver piece, the other costs 5 fucking gold. But it does the same thing.
The only fucking difference between a longsword and a battle axe is the weight.
Yeah.
To everyone that has ever held a weapon and fought, for example, me with a longsword, Shinai's kendo swords are longswords. Swinging that like a battle axe would completely defeat the purpose of this weapon.
Exactly.
And swinging a battle axe like a fucking sword would defeat its purpose. It would be terrible. And now, don't get me wrong. I firmly believe that abstraction is a good thing, and not trying to base everything in perfect realism is a good thing.
Yeah, agreed.
However,
a bit more nuances would be amazing.
Nuance is, I think, the important word you just used. Nuance is important. It's not about realism. It is about nuance for me. I don't care necessarily that much if a longsword or a battle axe should feel completely different from each other. I just want there to be a choice.
Yeah, and that choice to matter to some degree.
Yeah, the choice is purely aesthetic.
Exactly.
And I mean, that is, at the same time, it's also a good thing. If all the weapons basically are the same, you have full control over how you use it. Because at the end of the day, for the system, it does not matter. But then I would have loved for D&D to go even more abstract and basically just make like 6 different weapons that you can flavor all the way you want, because that's basically the weapon system anyway.
Yeah, 2 simple weapons, 2 martial weapons, and 2 exotics, for example, 1 ranged and 1 melee option, and then go ahead.
It would basically be short thing, middle thing, long thing, big thing, ranged thing.
Special.
special thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is that good? In my opinion, no. But it is how the weapon system is, just with a lot more options that no one chooses because they are just statistically worse than anything else.
Exactly. That is just something where I like the realism to weapons do feel a bit more like they are supposed to or could be. However you flavor your attacks with them, I don't care. But yeah, using a spear, you fight different than using a fucking short sword, just by positioning and stuff, you know? I mean, yeah, a spear is just a pointy stick, basically, but it's an amazing pointy stick. Completely underrated, in my opinion. But that's something completely different.
Yeah, for this discussion, it's a lot more about nuance than realism for me. Realism brings that nuance.
Yeah.
100%. So yeah, nuance comes through that realism. You get that nuance when you try to be as realistic as possible, because let's face it, our real world is a very nuanced place.
Oh yeah.
And for that reason, I do love myself some good realism in my games.
Yeah.
Because it is giving me the nuance I want. But it's not for the realism. I could not care less how magic is explained in physical ways. But when things that actually exist in our real world get explained with real world physics and real world history, that is going to give me nuance. But at the same time, I also do not want that much history of it. I'm going to be real honest. I want my games to be fantastical. I want my games to not make sense, because that is like half part of the fun for me, to experience stuff that I could not experience in the real world. So I do not want to have a complete actual representation of how it is, for example, to fight with the longsword or how to fight kendo, for example. I know how that feels, and let me be real, it is fucking boring when you put it on paper.
And it can get quite iffy if you want to make it too realistic to be represented in a game. So there, the abstraction is also needed, but just having the option to have an option fighting with a longsword or a spear, that those feel different, at least to some degree, is based in realism and brings the nuance that we want. And I think that goes for a lot of different things, not just for weapons. That's just something that is not necessarily close to heart, but I like historical medieval weaponry and stuff. It's just a pet peeve. I like how they look and how they were forged and crafted and blah, It's a pet peeve of mine. So that's something that I latch onto pretty quickly in regards to realism. But there are so many other things that can be nuanced through realism in all different types of games. And I think depending on where you put your focus in regards to realism, you should look at other systems as well, because every system has some sort of focus point in mind, whatever that may be, or however convoluted that may be represented in the rules. But if you want your game to be about just or a more accurate representation of medieval combat fighting, what the fuck? Combat fighting. A more accurate representation of medieval combat or medieval style combat, don't use D&D. That's not a good way to represent that.
I mean, right, for the game, for D&D, realism wouldn't make sense at all.
Exactly.
Half the game is based on being heroes that slay dragons. And no, not half the game. 90% of the game is based on that.
Yeah, the other 10% is about laying dragons.
That's what you said. But yes, do not use a system that does not want realism to try to play realistic.
Exactly.
Because you're gonna have a bad time, because you have to change so much about this game and therefore break the game internal realism. And I think that is very important, what some people don't realize. If you have a system, and I'm talking about a game system, but I could also talk about other kind of structures, like a social structure. These structures have built-in foundations that work inside of that structure. The system has ground-laying rules that work for it. At least that is assumed. Some games have rules that just contradict the game itself. That is also a thing that happens. But generally speaking, a game system is a complete system in itself. And when you want to add realism to it, you do that from within the system, not by tagging something from the outside onto its shell, saying, oh yeah, D&D, I want realistic combat, so I'm gonna just implement 300 extra pages of adding realistic combat.
Yeah.
It doesn't really work. It can provide a good experience to you, but I'm thinking to myself, you could have also just played a different game.
Yeah, for example, if you want hit zones to be a thing, and other types of swings that you can do with your weapons, but the weapon that you're doing the swing with doesn't really matter that much. Play The Witcher, for example. It has these hit zones and blah. It's a more detailed combat, but it takes longer. But it's more realistic in a way because it matters where you hit the target.
Yeah, but even then, right, The Witcher is also a game that is focused on the combat to be brutal and deadly.
Exactly.
Which, let's be real combat is.
Yeah.
I think when people talk about their realism and their verisimilitude, or whatever the word is, I don't give a fuck. It's always just thinly veiled. And I don't want to... It's thinly veiled bigotry in some cases. Not all, but in some cases it definitely is, especially when they're talking about like adding inclusion, adding diversity to a game. And they say, that's not realistic to me. That's not historically accurate. It's pure bigotry that they base that on.
Yeah.
Especially when they are playing a game like D&D. If they want to play their accurate history game, let them. Don't give a fuck about them any more than them saying, I won't play this in my different TTRPG that I've designed with my friends to play the exact experiences we have. They have nothing to say to you. And then that's that. But oftentimes when I hear people talk about realism, all I hear is, I want to be more in control, especially when I'm the game master, because I do control the realism at the end of the day, right? The words are always, the GM controls the world and all the NPCs and all the happenings in the world aside from the PCs. So if you want more realism in your game, to me that sounds more and more like you just want to be in more control. You sure, it's definitely based differently on different people, right? This is not saying that everyone that says, oh yeah, I want a realistic experience, to that they are also like a bad person. And I'm not saying that even saying you want more control is being a bad person. That is not what I'm saying, right? But I feel oftentimes when someone says, I want my games to be realistic, I always think to myself, but you're the GM. You control the realism anyway. Like, should you even want more realism because you could just make it?
Yeah, I think it can have that kind of vibe real quick. The thing is, for me, when I say I want more realism in certain regards to for whatever system we are playing, I kind of have in mind what my usual players like to do and how they are playing. It's just coming from a standpoint of, I know this game the longest. I've played the longest in this system. For example, now D&D, in regards to all of my friends in the group. So I know how the rules work in the game, but I know whatever you are usually trying to do wouldn't work within the rules, but with a more realistic approach to those rules, it would. So let's make that happen. It's not that I want more control, it's just that I'm taking more control to give back to my players because I know what they want to do or how they usually like to operate. They like to use weird but realistically functioning shit to make amazing stuff happen.
Yeah, it's coming back to those plans, right? I make bomb from simple things in this world, right? Because I do have the knowledge as a player. If you want realism, that idea gets shut down anyway because your character wouldn't know how to build a bomb from these three materials.
Exactly.
It's not realism if you poured the knowledge you have as a player into the game.
Exactly. It's realistic that it would work. It's not realistic that you could make it.
And I think that is exactly where it's at. A lot of times when there's discussions about realism, it's about the players doing stuff that would make realistic sense. But sometimes that gets broken for the characters. Because that would not be their realism. And I think it's way more important to think about the characters' realism than about the players' realism. What would make sense for these characters? What would they know? What plans could they come up?
Yeah, and usually the characters would know way more than my players usually do.
That as well, right? They've lived that experiences.
Yeah.
They've lived those experiences. They would know how the world works. At least they think they know. But that is what they base their experiences on. And it's very hard. And I'm going to be very honest that it's very hard when you're playing a character that has lived 25 years before you start playing them to actually portray them how they would be based on those experiences they've made in that fantasy or sci-fi world.
Exactly. You have lived 25 years on this planet, or however old you are. You have 25 years of experience under your belt in this specific world that you are on right now. The character has a completely different world. And grasping that 25 years is a fucking long time to amass experiences, and then really working with the experiences that your character would have had or that you wrote in your backstory for it or whatever is a difficult thing to do. It can get quite overwhelming at some points. Make it real for the character, not for yourself.
Yeah, and then I would also say, when you say make it real for the character, not for yourself, that is also only half true. Because it is impossible for you to understand the experiences this character had sometimes.
Exactly.
Right? It is impossible to portray them perfect. But also at the end of the day, right, we are here to play a game and have fun. So fuck that realism of having to try to portray the character as best as you can. Portray them however you want them to be portrayed. That is exactly why you are here at the table, right? That's the reason we are playing.
Exactly.
Realism is sometimes in the way of that. And then you need to throw it out the window. And at the same time, realism is what we base our experiences on. So you have to keep it inside. So where is the middle line?
Yeah, it's a walk on a mirror's edge, I think. You have to have realism to make it a game that you can connect with on certain degrees, but you can't have too much realism, so it builds a wall in front of you so you can't get through. It's a balancing act. And adjusting that on the fly can also work to some degree, as long as the baseline is still the same. For example, when or I don't have a specific example, but having a baseline realism of just gravity, air, physics, blah, the baseline stuff that you can, or the basic of a world plus magic, for example, and then not caring about too much more in terms of realism, but then, for example, a specific arc is just centered around surviving in the fucking snowstorm, or you being teleported to the snow plane, or whatever, right? And then shining a light in that regard, so the other rules that normally would take place in a standard arc aren't really in place right now, but shining a light on the realism in that regard can make the game feel more interesting because there's still something to do and still more fun stuff to do. And therefore, normally the surviving rules aren't really a thing in your game, but in that regard, because the situation calls for it, it can be.
Yeah.
And I think that in those instances, especially if it's a longer period of sessions that you would have these interactions with certain rules, you can turn up the realism and turn it back down to a comfortable level that everything just feels good to play at in the normal session.
Yeah.
But that's something that you have to talk about beforehand and not just spring on your players right in that instance.
I think you've hit it right on the head, right? It's a balancing act, first of all. But second of all, it is a table thing. And if your table is fine with it, jump between realistic scales wherever you want to go. I'm gonna be real, right? With most things that are being discussed online or even here on this podcast, it does not matter that much. But at the end of the day, putting a thought or two into it will improve your game. However, thinking about it way too long will not. It will drag you down. It will pull you into some place that at the end of the day could have been prevented. It's not really that fun. Base completely everything in perfect realism. And at the same time, it's not really that fun to basically just explain everything away with magic and fantasy. And that can happen because gods and whatever else, right? You want some baseline, you want some fundamentals that work for you. Right? We talked about that in the magic episode and in world building episodes. You need some fundamentals that will work for you, and that realism is part of those fundamentals.
Exactly. It's basically, as with every topic that we discuss here on the show, think about it a bit, but don't think too hard about it, because that just defeats the purpose. If you overthink it, no good. If you don't think about it at all, also not the best. But just give it a thought or two and then move on.
Yeah, but I think with realism, I think you can really just put a few thoughts into it and don't really have to do anything about it.
Exactly.
Because what I think, yes, it should be a discussion in session 0 about, I wouldn't necessarily make a discussion in session 0 about, okay, how realistic do we want this game to be? I think that question would not work in a session 0 for me. Because I think session 0 gives me the context for that realism. I do not need to ask the question, but through a session 0, talking about homebrew rules, talking about the world, talking about characters and what they want to do, gives me a baseline for that realism. For example, if one of my players wants to play a scientist, I, as a GM, will change the way I think about realism, I think, for that character. Because, okay, they're scientists. They want to probably do a lot of stuff with physics and chemistry, and, for example, build that bomb out of basic necessities. And then I could go, yeah, your character would be able to do that. And since it actually also works in the real world, no big problem, right? You still can't make a bomb out of just a tube of
toothpaste and a gum.
Yeah, you can't do that. But if you actually say, okay, I'm going to buy the necessities to build a bomb from basic necessities, and then we can look at if that would work or not. Sure. I'm gonna be very lenient on most stuff. And I think that's important, right? Especially with realism. I think it's so easy to say I want a realistic game experience. While it is even easier to just say I'm gonna be lenient with most stuff, and it's a case-by-case decision.
Yeah, I think this is a big thing. It's most of the time a case-by-case decision. You can't really say one size fits all. This is how realistic it's going to be, and period. Because it is not as easy as just saying that. Yeah. Because every instance and how realistic that instance should feel like depends on you, your players, the table, what they want to do, and all of that. It's always a combination, and as we said, a balancing act, and therefore you have to review it case by case and keep reviewing these things. Not necessarily analyze them down to the very last detail and say, yeah, okay, this works or not, or it doesn't, depending on how realistic you want it to be. But just give it a quick thought. Would that work? Sure. Period. Done.
I think especially right. Would that work in my world? Did we have something that is kind of similar and worked, or did that not work for some reason? Right. And let's be real. I'm going to say it because it has not been mentioned yet. There's a literal mechanic in most games that will tell you if your characters are able to do something or not. It is called the dice or whatever resolution mechanic you have for your game. If that mechanic says, for example, for a roll to build bomb, I don't know, a chemistry roll, right? And if the chemistry roll says the player states what they want to do with the materials provided, and if you think that with those materials provided, they would be able to achieve that outcome, set a DC and let them roll. That is your realism right there. The game says to you, if you think that the materials are enough and they roll high enough after that, they do build the bomb, period. But at the same time, you don't have to Google if the materials actually fit a bomb. You just say, okay, yeah, that seems good. That seems okay. Yeah, I like that idea. Sure, go ahead. And as soon as they roll, and the roll says they do.
Exactly.
You have to trust the game, I think, for your TTRPGs to be better. I think that is actually the better takeaway from the realism discussion, but not just about how much realism should you have, where does realism fall apart, where does realism work and help, because that is case by case, right? Generally, it helps. Generally, it will also fall apart if you think about it too much. But I think what's more important is trust the game you're playing. And I'm not talking not just about the system, but trust that the entire process of playing and this entire construct works. Because if you trust that, it is gonna be the better experience than trying to base everything in realism and trusting realism to do the job for you. I think that's why people like realism so much. It is something that they can understand, they can explain, and they can grasp. You don't need that in a setting where you're just having fun playing fantasy characters running around in a fantasy world. You don't need to trust that the experience is realistic. No. Because it doesn't have to be. Because the game says so.
Yeah, but regarding that, one thing that just came to my mind again was in regards to realism and a realistic session, what I really want to do at some point in my life is run a murder mystery session for a group of detectives playing detective. Real world detectives solving crimes. Them solving a murder mystery in a fantasy setting. Just to see how their real world, realistic logic transitions into their characters and works in world. Just to experience that.
If there are at least 3 to 4 to 5 private investigators, criminal lawyers or something are listening, hit us up on our email, doubledmpod@gmail.com. We would love to have Niels stream that game.
It would be a shit show, but I am so interested to see how something like this would go.
I mean, I'm gonna be honest. There's a podcast called Science and Sorceries, or a show that is called Science and Sorceries, which is all basically PhD doctorates and general scientists playing D&D and basing everything in science. They are doing that. And that is a cool concept, not gonna lie. Yeah. And it's a great show, by the way. It's very comedic, it's very fun, it's very, very enticing. Those people are combining the fantasy of the game with their real world experiences because they are a table that is meeting up for exactly that experience. But they have decided beforehand to combine that experience, right? I'm also mostly playing with academics, people that are either studying or have finished studying. Those people are fucking smart. They come up with ideas that are so random sometimes to me as a game master, but also so fucking smart. And then I have to run with it because this is the table experience I have with playing with a table of these academics. You study chemistry, so when you sit at my tables, Niels, and come up with a cool chemistry idea, sure, I will run with it.
Let me tell you, my characters will make great fireworks. Great looking fireworks. I just need the metals for it. Whether that metal is already known to the population or not, be that as it may, there will be green exploding rockets just for the hell of it.
And it would be fun, and that's what we are here for.
Exactly. So, yeah, and I think with that, I don't have anything else.
I am kind of done. I gonna be honest, I thought that this episode would end at 40 minutes. But we pulled through.
Yeah, we did. We did, as always.
No, but I really loved this discussion because I think it showcased a lot what I think as every time I hear someone really talk about realism, it's in my head, it all plays out of, yeah, I get what you mean, but why the fuck do we care that much to talk about this? But that's something sometimes at DoubleDM we also have to say at the end of the episode, okay, we did the episode, why the fuck did we talk about it? No, but it was really great. And I think that there's a lot of points where people can either get some inspiration for their own thoughts on their own games, and that is what we're here for.
Exactly. And I think with that, thank you all for listening to us just rambling and talking, and hear you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of DoubleDM. It appears you liked this one. What we had to say and our advice helped you. Why not show us how we helped you in a rating, or even write a review detailing us how we helped? You can do this on the platform that you are listening on right now. It's just a few clicks, doesn't take long, and helps us out. It gets us out there and our advice into more ears of more people. Thanks again for listening and joining us on this amazing journey. Have a great day, and hear you on the next one. Bye-bye.